Today, we're diving into a really high-stakes battle over who actually gets to control the nuts and bolts of American elections. And we're putting mail-in voting right under the microscope. This isn't just about party politics. It's a fundamental fight over the future of the ballot itself.
Okay, let's just jump right into the timeline here. This really maps out how a federal campaign to reshape voting by mail has been building. It all starts with these operational changes at the Postal Service, but then the pressure just escalates, right? You see executive orders, major legislative battles, and it's all building towards a huge stress test, the 2026 midterm elections.
So how exactly is this campaign being waged? Well, the federal strategy is basically a two-pronged attack. It uses direct executive action and, at the same time, pushes for some really sweeping new laws. Both are designed to pull election control away from the states and centralize it in Washington. And this approach is really methodical. First, they use the power of the executive branch, think federal agencies, to create immediate hurdles for voters. Then, the goal is to make those hurdles permanent by writing them into federal law. If they succeed, the entire electoral landscape gets transformed. This whole strategy really kicked off back in 2020. Under Postmaster General Louis DeJoy, a series of so-called reforms were put in place. Things like ripping out high-speed sorting machines and cutting overtime. Later, an Inspector General report came out and found that these changes, which were made without any analysis, by the way, caused mail delays to spike by 143% right before a major election. That set a really powerful precedent. Now, this slide details what is probably the most aggressive federal action we've seen yet, the 2026 whitelisting order. It basically tells federal agencies to create a master list of approved voters. And then, get this, it orders the Postal Service to act as a gatekeeper and literally block ballots from being delivered to anyone who isn't on that list. The legislative side is just as aggressive. The Save America Act, which passed the House in early 2026, tries to lock these hurdles into law. Critics are calling it a show your papers mandate because it requires you to prove your citizenship in person just to register. It also makes you include a photocopy of your ID with every single mail-in ballot. And on top of all that, it threatens the election officials themselves with criminal penalties. So let's talk about what all these policies actually mean for the average voter. On the ground, they create what you could call a gauntlet, a series of really difficult obstacles for millions of Americans to get through just to vote. The sheer scale of the impact is pretty staggering. 21 million. That's how many American citizens don't have easy access to the very documents, like a birth certificate or passport, that the SAVE Act requires. And as you can imagine, this burden doesn't fall on everyone equally. It disproportionately hits people of color and younger voters. And this chart right here just brilliantly illustrates why these new rules have such a targeted effect. I mean, look at the huge partisan divide over who even uses mail-in voting. You have 83% of Democrats supporting it compared to just 32% of Republicans. So with numbers like that, any friction you add to the process is mathematically guaranteed to hit Democratic-leaning voters much, much harder. I mean, just look at this comparison. It shows you how stark the shift really is. We go from a system that's all about accessibility, registering online, by mail, at the DMV, to a system that demands you take time off work, travel to an office, and bring specific, original documents that, as we just saw, millions of people just don't have lying around. And of course, these changes don't affect everyone in the same way. They create a gauntlet that's way harder for some groups to navigate. We're talking about voters with disabilities who really rely on mail-in ballots, military members serving overseas, and young people who've moved away for school or a job and don't have their birth certificate with them. But, this federal push isn't happening in a vacuum. States, advocacy groups, and voters themselves are building what you could call a firewall to defend their traditional authority over elections. They're not just taking this lying down. The counter-strategy is basically a three-part effort. They're fighting back in the courts, arguing this is unconstitutional. They're fighting in the state houses, passing their own protective laws. And they're fighting on the streets, organizing communities block by block. And this is not a small-scale reaction. Just look at this. The legislative pushback is massive. In just 1 year, half the country took active steps to put voter protections into their own state laws, creating these legal safe harbors against federal interference. And these aren't just some vague resolutions either. These state laws and mobilization strategies are really smart. They're specifically designed to counteract the exact friction points that the federal actions are creating. Things like laws that give you a chance to fix a simple mistake on your ballot, or grassroots models that build hyper-local, trusted networks for voter education. Now, ultimately, a lot of these legal challenges are going to find their way to the nation's highest court. And that makes the Supreme Court the final referee in this constitutional tug-of-war between federal and state power. So here's the thing. A potential Supreme Court ruling could create a strict, nationwide Election Day receipt deadline. This would be a massive blow to mail-in voting. It would instantly wipe out the more flexible laws that are already on the books in 30 different states. And this data right here quantifies exactly what's at stake. We're not talking about a handful of votes. In 2024, over 400,000 legally cast ballots arrived after Election Day in California alone. Hundreds of thousands more did the same in states like Washington and Illinois. All of those votes could be disqualified by a single court ruling. Okay, so let's connect all these different threads. How could this conflict directly shape who wins the 2026 midterms, where, control of Congress is hanging in the balance? Well, according to Fair Vote's analysis, over 80% of House seats are already considered safe for one party or the other. That means control of the entire House of Representatives is probably going to be decided in just 35 toss-up districts. And in races that close, even a tiny shift in how many mail-in ballots get rejected could easily decide the winner. But beyond just the math, there's another major risk here, and that's the ongoing erosion of public trust. We're seeing this really worrying sore loser pattern, where people's confidence in our elections now seems to depend heavily on which party is in power. And that trend, it threatens the legitimacy of our whole democratic process, no matter who wins. So let's recap. What is the fundamental conflict we've just explored? Because it really goes much deeper than just a simple disagreement over some rules. What we've seen is a very deliberate federal push to centralize control, and that's clashing head-on with a really robust, state-led defense of voter access. This is a battle between using agencies like the Postal Service as gatekeepers on one side and states building legislative firewalls on the other. The result is a historic stress test for American elections, and honestly, the outcome is hanging in the balance.
And this leaves us with a provocative final question that really gets to the absolute heart of this whole conflict. Who should run our elections? Is the future going to be one of centralized federal control, or will the longstanding tradition of state sovereignty win out? The answer to that is going to define our democratic process for generations to come.
Thanks for joining us for this explainer. If you want to dig deeper into any of this, you can find the links to all the source material we discussed right down in the description below.